You know that feeling? You're looking at a big topic, maybe it's for work, maybe you're just trying to learn something new, and suddenly you're just buried under this mountain of information, books, articles, reports. You just need someone to grab you by the hand and say, okay, this is what really matters.
It's the modern challenge, isn't it? Wanting to be well informed, but the sheer volume, well, it makes it daunting. Especially with something like project management, which has a very specific structured body of knowledge.
Absolutely. And that's precisely our mission in this deep dive. You've given us this stack of information all rooted in the project management body of knowledge, the PMBO key guide, right? Specifically, the sixth edition. It's kind of the go-to roadmap for project professionals, packed with validated knowledge.
Yeah, our source is essentially a comprehensive guide, the kind you'd use for PMP certification prep. It's authoritative, no doubt, but it can be pretty dense.
Right. So we're not trying to replace that full guide, obviously. Our job here is to cut through the noise. We're going to extract the most important nuggets, connect the dots, and give you that clear picture of how projects are managed effectively, why it's done this way, and what the absolute core pieces are.
Think of it like getting the essential roadmap.
Exactly. An insightful roadmap to understanding how complex efforts get done, from kickoff all the way to the finish line.
And we'll uncover some really interesting stuff along the way, like how projects aren't just tasks, but they're key drivers of an organization's strategy.
Okay.
Why temporary doesn't actually mean quick. How measuring success, well, it goes way beyond just hitting a deadline or a budget number. And some specific tools and approaches project managers rely on every single day.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start at the absolute beginning, the fundamentals. What is a project in the structured world, and why on earth does managing it professionally even matter?
Well, the source gives us a very specific definition right up front. A project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result.
Okay, temporary. That feels straightforward, like it ends at some point.
Exactly. It has the definite start and a definite end. It's not like ongoing operations, say, keeping a factory running or handling customer service calls. Those are continuous. A project is more like a one-time push. But here's where it gets interesting. Temporary doesn't necessarily mean short. A project could take years. What's temporary is the effort, the team coming together for this specific goal. The result itself can be permanent. You build a bridge. Hopefully that stands for a long, long time.
Good point. The result isn't temporary and unique.
The output is distinct. Even if you're building, say, 10 houses that look similar, each one is unique in its location, the specific challenges of that particular site, maybe different weather during construction. Every project has these unique elements that make it different from doing it before or doing it again.
So it's a focused, bounded effort, creating something specific and distinct.
Okay, this leads to the big question then. Why can't we just sort of figure it out as we go? Why do we need professional project management?
This is where the strategic link comes in, and it's honestly one of the most important takeaways from the source. Organizations have big goals, right? Grow market share, increase revenue, launch a new product line. These are their strategic plans.
The big picture stuff.
Exactly. How do they achieve those plans? Often, it's by converting them into projects. Successful projects are a primary way for an organization to actually realize its strategy.
So project management isn't just about ticking off tasks. It's directly enabling the organization's fundamental purpose.
Precisely. And when projects aren't managed well, or maybe not managed professionally at all, the source lists the classic outcomes we've all probably seen. Missed deadlines, costs ballooning out of control, poor quality that needs expensive rework, uncontrolled changes, scope creep.
Yeah, scope creep. Stakeholders who are unhappy, and ultimately the project failing to deliver on the very objective it was started for. Professional management brings that structure needed to avoid those very expensive, very frustrating failures.
That makes perfect sense. So project management itself is the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques, KSTT, they call it, to project activities to meet project requirements. It's the discipline you apply to make that temporary, unique endeavor successful.
Right. And this shapes how we think about success. For a long time, people used the iron triangle. Success meant finishing on time, on budget, and within scope. Maybe add quality in there too.
Still simple enough, maybe too simple.
It is, because it misses the why. The source really emphasizes that true project success must also include achieving the project objectives. Did you actually deliver the intended value? Did you meet the business need that was outlined in the business case?
So it's not just did we build the thing right, but did we build the right thing?
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better. To really measure success, you need to define upfront. What does success look like for this specific project? How are we going to measure it?
Okay.
The source mentions specific metrics, often tied back to that business case, like benefit cost ratio is greater than 1, lowest payback period, net present value, NPV, internal rate of return, IRR. Did the investment actually pay off?
Yeah.
And just as crucially, were the stakeholders satisfied?
Okay, got it. It's about delivering value and meeting the original purpose, not just, managing the constraints. Now, projects don't exist in a vacuum, right? They live within an environment. The source highlights two major influences: enterprise environmental factors, EEFs, and organizational process assets, OPAs.
Yeah, EFs and OPAs. EFs are things outside the project team's direct control. The influence or constrain the project. Think of them as the operating conditions, the context.
Like the weather, maybe, or the market conditions.
Yes, both internal and external factors. The source gives examples like the company culture, the existing organizational structure, the available infrastructure, maybe resources that are already tied up elsewhere, market conditions, even external commercial databases, or, the weather. You can't control them, but you have to work within them.
And OPAs. That sounds like stuff the organization has or does, internal assets.
Exactly. These are the organization's assets. They fall into two main buckets. First, policies, procedures, and templates, like standard processes for getting approvals or pre-made reporting templates.
Okay.
And second, the corporate knowledge base.
The knowledge base, like lessons learned from past projects?
Precisely. Historical information, lessons learned. This is incredibly valuable stuff, often maintained by the project management office or PMO.
The PMO. Source talks about organizational structures too, and how they impact the project manager's authority, their level of power.
Right. This is really practical stuff. In a traditional functional structure, the PM often has very little authority. Their role might even be part-time. In a fully projectized structure, the PM has pretty much full authority, and the team is dedicated just to that project.
So extremes.
Yeah. And most organizations today are somewhere in the middle, using matrix structures which the source breaks down into weak, balanced, or strong, depending on the PM's power relative to the functional managers. In a balanced matrix, which is pretty common, the PM shares authority. That means team members might report to two bosses, the PM and their functional manager. It's definitely a balancing act.
That explains a lot about corporate life. And the PMO, you said it standardizes processes.
Yes. Among other things, they standardize governance, they facilitate sharing of resources, methodologies, tools. They can act as a repository for that historical info and lessons learned, develop templates, manage shared resources across projects, even help prioritize projects across the whole organization to make sure they align with the overall strategy.
So they can have different levels of control.
Yeah, the source mentions three types: supportive, low control, more like a resource library; controlling, requires compliance with standards and methodologies; and directive, high control, where the PMO actually manages the projects directly.
Okay, so projects live within this organizational context. They also go through phases, right? A life cycle.
Yes, the project life cycle. Projects typically start with lower cost and staffing needs. Then these peak during the main work execution, and then they drop off as the project closes out.
Makes sense.
The source highlights phase gates, sometimes called kill points at the end of phases. These are formal review points to decide whether to continue funding and moving forward with the project, or maybe to terminate it if it's no longer viable.
Important checkpoints. And different kinds of projects might have different life cycles, not one size fits all.
Absolutely. The source outlines several. Predictive, which is the traditional waterfall model. It's very plan-driven. You define scope, time, and cost up front, and changes are controlled pretty strictly. Then there's iterative, where the scope might be generally fixed, but the requirements evolve through repeated cycles or iterations. Incremental focuses on delivering usable pieces or increments of the product quickly.
Right.
Adaptive, which is often called agile, is very change-driven. It often combines iterative and incremental approaches. Requirements are expected to be dynamic, and the main goal is delivering customer value frequently through short cycles.
And hybrid.
Just what it sounds like.
Yeah.
A mix of predictive and adaptive elements tailored to the specific project needs.
So not everything is a rigid step-by-step process. Agile or adaptive sounds like it's really built for dealing with uncertainty.
It is, definitely. Shorter cycles, continuous feedback loops, adapting as you go.
Let's circle back to stakeholders. You mentioned PMs spend a lot of time communicating with them.
Yes, they're absolutely critical. Stakeholders are basically anyone who can impact the project or might be impacted by the project: individuals, groups, organizations. This includes your project team, your sponsor who funds it, the customer, end users, maybe even regulators or the local community.
And identifying them early and figuring out how to engage them correctly is key.
Absolutely critical for success. You need to understand their interest, their influence, their potential impact, and manage that relationship throughout the project lifecycle.
And keeping track of all the project information seems vital too. The source makes a distinction between work performance data, work performance information, and work performance reports. Can you break that down?
Sure. Data is the raw stuff,
Yeah.
raw observations and measurements. Things like dates activities actually started, costs actually incurred, the percent physically completed on a task,
Yeah.
just the facts.
Okay, raw data.
Information's where you analyze that data. You compare the raw data to the plan. Are we ahead or behind schedule?
Huh.
Over or under budget? It's the context, the analysis, variance measurement.
Analysis, got it.
And reports are the formatted output of that information. Things like status reports, dashboards, charts. They're designed to communicate that analyzed information effectively to different stakeholders.
Raw facts, analysis, and then communication. Got it. Finally, in these fundamentals, the project manager's role seems pretty central.
They are absolutely central to success. They apply the knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques we talked about. And importantly, they integrate all the project activities across the different areas: scope, schedule, cost, risk, etc. The source also emphasizes that the PM's role has kind of expanded over time. They often collaborate on the initial business case and the benefits realization plan, and they spend a lot of time managing relationships and interfaces with various internal and external groups.
They're kind of the conductor of the orchestra, making sure everyone plays together. Okay, that's a really solid foundation. We understand what a project is, why structured management is important, the environment it lives in. Now let's get into how the process groups. The source organizes the actual project management work into 5 groups, right?
Right. Initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling, and closing. And crucially, the source stresses these are not just phases you do once in order, like step 1, step 2. They are groups of related processes that you apply as needed throughout the project's life cycle. Planning, for example, happens heavily up front, but you definitely revisit it. Monitoring and controlling happens pretty much from start to finish.
Makes sense. Okay, let's walk through them conceptually. Initiating sounds like getting things started, kicking it off.
That's exactly it. This is where the project or a new phase of the project is formally authorized. You define the initial objectives. Now, before you even get here, someone, somewhere identified a business need, maybe did a feasibility study. This all leads to the business case.
The justification for doing the project in the first place. Why spend the money?
Yes. Why should the organization invest time and money? What's the business need we're trying to address? What benefits do we expect to get? The business case often includes that financial analysis we touched on earlier, benefit cost ratio, NPV, etc. This document is often referred back to throughout the project to make sure it stays aligned with its original purpose.
And the key output here, the really important document, is the project charter.
The project charter is huge. It's the formal document that basically says, okay, this project is official, and this is vital. It gives the project manager the authority to apply organizational resources, people, money, equipment to project activities. It's typically signed by the project sponsor, who is usually someone senior with the funding authority and clout.
So the PM needs that charter.
Absolutely. Ideally, the PM is assigned early, maybe even before the charter is finalized, so they can contribute to defining those initial objectives and scope.
So the charter isn't just paperwork. It's the PM's formal mandate.
Okay.
Initiating is also where you identify stakeholders for the first time.
Yes, you identify them at or before the charter is approved. But it's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process you repeat as needed. Significant changes in the project. Moving into a new phase, these might bring new stakeholders into the picture, or change the influence of existing ones. The output here is the stakeholder register, which is basically a list of the stakeholders and some initial assessment information, like their potential interest and influence on the project.
And for those adaptive or agile projects, maybe the initiation is a bit lighter, less formal.
Correct. Less elaborate upfront documentation, maybe a simpler charter, but one that you might revisit and revalidate more frequently as the requirements evolve and become clearer.
Okay, from initiating, we move to planning. This feels like it's going to be the most detailed part, where the real map gets drawn.
It is. It's definitely the most process-heavy group. This is where you define the path forward to meet those objectives set in initiation. You refine them, you detail everything you need to do, when you need to do it, how, with what resources, and how you'll manage all the potential risks.
And it's not just the PM locked in a room planning alone, right?
No, absolutely not. Good planning is iterative. and requires involvement from the team members and key stakeholders. Their input is crucial. And like we touched on, in adaptive environments, planning is often just in time. Detailed planning might only be done for the next short iteration, maybe the next sprint in Scrum, with the overall roadmap being less defined upfront and allowed to emerge.
The big deliverable from planning, the main output, is the project management plan.
This is the core document. It essentially aggregates and integrates all the subsidiary plans from the different knowledge areas: scope, schedule, cost, quality, resources, communications, risk, procurement, stakeholders. It provides the baselines, your approved targets for scope, schedule, and cost. And it acts as the framework for actually executing the work, monitoring progress, controlling changes, and eventually closing the project.
And it's a living document.
It is, but formal changes to the baselines typically require going through that integrated change control process we'll talk about later.
Okay, let's dive into some of the key areas within planning. Scope management, first defining what the project is actually going to produce and what it's not.
Right. And the source makes a useful distinction here between product scope, the features and functions of the final thing you're delivering, and project scope, which is all the work needed to deliver those features. It's about defining the boundaries clearly.
So the processes here involve planning how you'll manage scope, then actually collecting the requirements, defining the detailed scope, and creating the work breakdown structure, or WBS.
Exactly. Collecting requirements is where you dig in and figure out what the stakeholders actually need. This involves using lots of different techniques. Think interviews, focus groups, facilitated workshops. The source mentions specific techniques like nominal group technique, which is a more structured form of brainstorming with voting, or using prototypes to get early feedback, or even things like user stories in agile contexts.
Describing who needs what and why.
Yeah. And the outputs are things like the requirements documentation, just the collected list of agreed upon requirements, and the requirements traceability matrix, or RTM.
The RTM, tell me more about that.
The RTM is super helpful, actually. It links each individual requirement back to its origin, like the business need or project objective it supports, and forward to where it's actually delivered in the project work, usually a WBS component, and also how you'll verify that it's been met, like linking it to specific test cases.
So it tracks the requirement through its whole life.
Exactly. It helps ensure every requirement adds business value, make sure nothing gets lost or forgotten, and it's really useful when managing changes or planning testing later on.
It makes sure you don't build stuff nobody actually asked for. Then you take those requirements and define the detailed scope statement and create the WBS.
Right. The WBS is fundamental. It's a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. You break down the major deliverables into smaller, more manageable components and keep dividing them until you get down to a level called work packages.
Work packages.
Yeah, that's the lowest level in the WBS. You decompose down until you reach a point where you can reliably estimate the effort, cost, and duration needed for that piece of work and where it can be assigned to someone to manage. It's like creating a detailed outline for everything the project will produce, organized by deliverable.
Got it. Okay, moving on to schedule management. Clearly about the timeline, the when.
Right. And similar structure here. First, you plan how you'll manage the schedule that goes into the schedule management plan. Then you define activities. This is where you decompose those WBS work packages down into the specific activities or tasks that need to be performed to produce them.
So the WBS is about deliverables. The activity list is about the actions.
Exactly. The activity list is the basis for estimating, scheduling, executing, and monitoring the project work. You also define things like activity attributes, more detail about each task, and a milestone list, significant points or events in the project, usually with 0 duration.
Then you sequence the activities, figure out the dependencies. Like you said, you have to pour the foundation before you can build the walls.
Precisely. That's a finish-to-start dependency, the most common type. But you can also have activities that need to start at the same time, start to start, or finish at the same time, finish to finish. There's even a start to finish, though it's rare. The source mentions the precedence diagramming method, PBM, using nodes and arrows to visualize these relationships.
And different kinds of dependencies.
Yeah. Mandatory dependencies, sometimes called hard logic, which are inherent in the nature of the work itself. Discretionary dependencies, or soft logic, which are based on best practices or preferences. External dependencies, which involve things outside the project team's control, like waiting for a permit. And internal dependencies, which are within the project team's control. You can also use leads, which allow an overlap between tasks, or lags, which impose a waiting time.
Okay, sequence defined, then you estimate how long each activity will take. Duration estimates.
Yes, and there are several techniques here. Analogous estimating is top-down, using historical data from similar past projects. It's quick, but less accurate, often used early on for a rough order of magnitude or ROM estimate.
ROM, okay.
Parametric estimating uses a statistical relationship, like cost per square foot multiplied by the number of square feet. It can be quite accurate if the underlying data and model are good. Three-point estimating considers optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely durations. The Peart formula, O plus P plus 4M6, is a common way to calculate the expected duration from this. And bottom-up estimating is the most detailed. You estimate each individual activity and then roll those estimates up. It's generally the most accurate, but also takes the most effort.
So different tools for different levels of detail or certainty?
Exactly. And expert judgment is often used in combination with these.
And finally, you put it all together to develop the schedule.
This is where you analyze the activity sequences, durations, resource requirements, and schedule constraints to create the actual project schedule model.
Yeah.
A key technique here is the critical path method, CPM.
The critical path, that's the longest sequence of activities.
Yes, it determines the shortest possible project duration. Any delay on an activity on the critical path will delay the entire project finish date, unless you do something about it. Activities on the critical path have zero float or slack.
Float being the amount of time an activity can slip without delaying the project.
Correct. Other techniques used here include schedule compression, trying to shorten the schedule duration without reducing scope. Two main ways are crashing, which means adding more resources to critical path activities, usually increases cost, and fast tracking, which means doing activities or phases in parallel that would normally be done sequentially, usually increases risk.
Trade-offs.
Always trade-offs. You also use resource optimization techniques. Resource leveling adjusts start and finish dates based on resource constraints, aiming for a balanced use of resources, but it can often change the critical path and make the project longer. Resource smoothing adjusts activities only within their available float, so it doesn't change the critical path, but it might not fully resolve resource conflicts.
And you can use simulations, like Monte Carlo analysis.
Yeah, Monte Carlo can model the combined effect of individual risks on the overall schedule, giving you a probability distribution of possible completion dates, often shown as an S-curve. Helps understand the likelihood of hitting a target date.
Okay. The output is the project schedule itself, and the approved version is the schedule baseline.
Exactly. That baseline is what you'll measure performance against.
Cost management seems to run parallel to schedule, following a similar logic.
It really does. First, plan cost management, how you'll estimate, budget, manage, monitor, and control costs. This goes into the cost management plan. Then, estimate costs for the resources needed to complete project activities. And finally, determine budget by aggregating those estimated costs to establish an authorized cost baseline.
And the estimating techniques are similar. Analogous, parametric, bottom-up.
Yes, the same core techniques apply. You estimate costs for everything: labor, materials, equipment, services, facilities, maybe contingency reserves. Accuracy ranges again from that rough ROM estimate, negative 25% to plus 75% accuracy early on, to a more definitive estimate, negative 5% to plus 10% accuracy as you get more detail, often using bottom-up.
And the output is the cost baseline.
Yes, the approved version of the time-phased project budget. It's typically displayed as an S-curve, showing cumulative costs over time. This is your target for cost performance measurement. It's important to note the source says the cost baseline usually excludes management reserves. Those are funds set aside for unforeseen, unknown risks managed at a higher level. The baseline includes contingency reserves for known risks.
Okay, distinction noted. Let's talk quality management, making sure the output is actually fit for purpose.
Right. And the source makes a clear distinction here. Quality is the degree to which a set of inherent characteristics fulfill requirements. Grade is a category assigned based on functional use but different technical characteristics. Low quality is always bad. Low grade might be perfectly acceptable if it meets the requirements for that grade.
And avoid gold plating.
Absolutely. Adding extra features or higher quality than required just adds cost and time without necessarily delivering value the customer wants or needs. It can even introduce risk.
Cost of quality is a key concept here, too.
Yes. The idea is that it's cheaper to invest in preventing defects. Cost of conformance. Prevention costs like training, good processes, appraisal costs like testing, inspections, than it is to deal with failures after they occur. Cost of nonconformance. Internal failures found before delivery like rework. External failures found after delivery like warranty claims, lost business. Especially costly are escape defects found by the customer.
Makes sense. So planning involves identifying the quality requirements and standards for the project and its deliverables, and documenting how you'll demonstrate compliance in the quality management plan.
Exactly. Using tools like cost-benefit analysis, maybe flowcharts to understand processes, and planning for tests and inspections.
Resource management, this covers both the physical stuff, like materials and equipment, and the people, the team resources.
Correct. It's about identifying, acquiring, and managing the resources needed for the successful completion of the project. For team resources, the source emphasizes the importance of things like emotional intelligence, EI, both for the PM and the team as a whole.
Hmm.
It also mentions self-organizing teams, common in Agile, where the PM acts more like a servant leader, and the challenges and benefits of managing virtual teams spread across locations.
So planning involves figuring out how you'll estimate, acquire, manage, and use both physical and team resources. This goes into the resource management plan and maybe a team charter.
Yes. The resource management plan covers things like how resources will be identified, acquired, managed, and controlled. It defines roles and responsibilities. Might include an organization chart, plans for team management like training, development, recognition. A team charter is often developed by the team itself to outline their values, ground rules, decision-making processes, conflict resolution approach.
Then you estimate activity resources, figuring out the type and quantity needed for each activity.
Using techniques like bottom-up estimating, expert judgment, maybe analogous or parametric again, and analyzing alternatives like make versus buy versus rent.
Okay. Communications management, you mentioned earlier, the PM spends something like 90% of their time communicating.
That's the often quoted figure, yeah. Communication is the bridge, connecting diverse stakeholders with different perspectives, needs, and expectations.
Effective communication is key. What makes it effective?
The source highlights clarity, ensuring the message is understood by the receiver, and monitoring the communication's effectiveness. It also mentions the 5 C's: correct grammar and spelling, concise expression, clear purpose and message, coherent flow of ideas, and controlling the flow of information. Essential skills include active listening, cultural awareness, managing expectations, and interpersonal skills like persuading, motivating, coaching, negotiating, and resolving conflicts.
So planning communications involves figuring out who needs what information, when they need it, how it should be delivered, format, method, and who's responsible, documenting all that in the communications management plan.
Exactly. A key technique here is communication requirements analysis, really understanding the stakeholders' information needs. You need to consider the number of potential communication channels, which grows rapidly with more stakeholders. The formula is N times N minus 1 divided by 2, where N is the number of stakeholders.
Wow, that number gets big fast.
It does. And you need to choose appropriate communication methods. Interactive, like meetings, calls most efficient for understanding. Push, like emails, memos sent to specific recipients. Or pull, like websites, SharePoint sites, recipients access info at their own discretion. Technology choices are also important.
Okay, risk management dealing with all the uncertainties inherent in project.
Yeah, projects are inherently uncertain, so risk management is crucial, and it's an iterative process throughout the project. A risk is defined as an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more project objectives.
Positive or negative, so risks aren't always bad.
Correct. Negative risks are threats. Positive risks are opportunities. You manage both. The source also distinguishes between individual project risks, specific uncertain events, and overall project risk, the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole. And people have different risk attitudes, their appetite for risk, their tolerance levels, their thresholds.
Interesting. Any specific types of risk mentioned?
Yeah, variability risk, which is uncertainty about some key characteristic of a planned event or activity, like productivity might be above or below target, often addressed using Monte Carlo analysis. And ambiguity risk, which is uncertainty about what might happen in the future, like uncertainty about market conditions or regulatory changes, addressed by defining knowledge gaps, maybe benchmarking or prototyping.
So planning starts with the risk management plan, deciding how you'll conduct risk management activities.
Yes, this plan sets the framework, the methodology you'll use, roles and responsibilities, budgeting for risk activities, timing, how you'll categorize risks, often using a risk breakdown structure or RBS, definitions of probability and impact scales, the probability and impact matrix you'll use for prioritization, and documenting stakeholder risk appetite.
Then you identify risks, brainstorming what could go wrong or right.
Exactly. Creating the initial list of individual risks and sources of overall project risk. This goes into the risk register. Techniques include brainstorming, checklist analysis based on historical info, assumption analysis, what assumptions are risky, diagramming techniques like cause and effect, Ishikawa or fishbone, diagrams or flowcharts, SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and using prompt lists based on risk categories.
So you get a list of risks, then you analyze them qualitatively.
Usually, yes. Perform qualitative risk analysis is about prioritizing the identified risks for further analysis or action. You assess the probability of each risk occurring and its potential impact on objectives, scope, schedule, cost, quality. You multiply these to get a risk score or rating, often using that probability and impact matrix, and then you rank the risks, maybe grouping them into high, medium, low priority categories. You also assess things like risk urgency.
Okay, prioritize. And then sometimes you do quantitative analysis.
Sometimes, especially for high priority risks or for the project overall. Perform quantitative risk analysis numerically analyzes the combined effect of identified individual risks and other sources of uncertainty on overall project objectives. It's more sophisticated.
What techniques are used here?
Data gathering like interviews. Data analysis techniques like simulation, most commonly Monte Carlo analysis, which runs many iterations to model the combined impact and produces outputs like probability distributions for cost or schedule, those S-curves again. Sensitivity analysis helps determine which risks have the most potential impact on objectives, often shown visually using a tornado diagram. Decision tree analysis is used to evaluate decisions with uncertainty, calculating the expected monetary value, EMV, of different options.
So quantitative gives you numbers on the overall exposure.
Yes, often documented in a risk report. The risk register is also updated with the quantitative analysis results for specific risks.
And after all that analysis, you plan risk responses, deciding what you're actually going to do about the important risks.
This is critical. You develop options, select strategies, and agree on actions to address overall risk exposure, as well as to treat individual risks. The agreed-upon actions are then integrated back into the project plan. They might change scope, add activities to the schedule, or require budget contingency reserves.
What are the main strategies?
For threats, negative risks, the source lists. Escalate, if it's outside the PM's authority. Avoid, change the plan to eliminate the threat or protect objectives from its impact. Transfer, shift the ownership and/or impact to a third party, like buying insurance or using certain contracts. Mitigate, take action to reduce the probability of occurrence and/or the impact, and acknowledge the risk and take no action unless it occurs, passive acceptance, or establish a contingency reserve plan, active acceptance.
Okay, 5 options for threats. What about opportunities, positive risks?
Similar structure. Escalate, if outside PM authority. Exploit, take actions to ensure the opportunity is realized. Share, allocate ownership to a third party best able to capture the benefit. Enhance, increase the probability and positive impacts. And accept, be willing to take advantage if it arises, but not actively pursue it.
Makes sense. Handle both sides of the coin. Procurement management comes next when you need to buy goods or services from outside the project team.
Right. This involves managing relationships with sellers or suppliers, and it often involves formal, legal, contractual obligations. Tailoring how you manage procurement is important based on project complexity, risk, and location.
Planning here involves deciding what to procure, how to do it, like the contract type, and when.
Exactly. This leads to the procurement management plan, which guides how procurement processes will be managed from developing documentation through contract closure. You also develop a procurement strategy and, for each item you plan to procure, a detailed procurement statement of work, SOW, describing the procurement item sufficiently for sellers to determine if they can provide it.
Make or buy analysis happens here.
Yes, deciding whether it's better for the project to produce something internally or buy it from an external source. Contract types are also a major consideration.
You mentioned those before, fixed price.
Fixed price contracts, like firm fixed price, FFP, set a fixed total price for a defined product or service. The seller bears more risk of cost overruns, but the buyer faces risk if the scope isn't well defined and changes are needed.
Cost plus.
Cost reimbursable contracts, like cost plus fixed fee, CBFF, or cost plus incentive fee, CPIF, involve paying the seller for their actual costs, plus a fee representing seller profit. The buyer bears more cost risk here, as total costs aren't fixed up front, often used when scope is less certain.
And time and material.
Time and material T&M contracts are a hybrid. The buyer pays on a per hour or per item basis. They're often used for staff augmentation or when the scope or duration is very uncertain at the start. They require monitoring as costs can grow indefinitely.
Okay, different tools for different situations. Lastly, in planning, stakeholder management. We identified them earlier, but now you plan how to keep them engaged.
Yes, the process is planned stakeholder engagement. Based on the analysis of their needs, interests, expectations, and potential impact on the project, often done during Identify Stakeholders and Updated, you develop strategies for how to effectively engage them throughout the project lifecycle. This goes into the stakeholder engagement plan. How do you communicate with them, involve them in decisions, manage their expectations, and ensure their continued support?
Wow, that's a huge amount of planning. It really feels like laying the entire groundwork, creating the detailed map and rule book for the project. Now, let's move to the executing process group. This sounds like where the actual building, the actual work happens.
It is. This is where the team performs the work defined in the project management plan to achieve the project objectives. You're leading the team, carrying out the activities, producing the project deliverables. The key process coordinating all this is direct and manage project work.
And this is where you generate that work performance data, those raw facts about what's happening.
Exactly. Data like which activities have started or finished, costs actually incurred, actual durations, percent physically complete. It's also where issues that inevitably arise during execution get logged and managed in an issue log, and where change requests are often generated if something needs to be adjusted from the plan. And importantly, you implement approved changes, corrective actions, preventive actions, and defect repairs here.
The source also includes managed project knowledge within executing. Seems important.
It's crucial for continuous improvement and organizational learning. It's about actively using existing organizational knowledge effectively, and also creating new knowledge generated during the project and making sure it's available to others. They make a key distinction between explicit knowledge,
The stuff you can write down.
codified knowledge like documents, databases, lessons learned registers, and tacit knowledge.
The stuff in people's heads.
Know-how. Exactly. Personal experience, intuition, know-how. It's harder to codify. The source says managing explicit knowledge often involves information management tools and techniques connecting people to information, like libraries, databases, lessons learned repositories. Managing tacit knowledge often relies on knowledge management tools and techniques connecting people to people, like networking, communities of practice, mentoring, shadowing, storytelling, workshops.
So capturing both types.
And a key output is often updates to the lessons learned register, capturing what went well, what didn't, and recommendations for the future.
So you're not just doing the work, you're actively learning from it as you go. You also acquire resources here and then develop and manage the project team.
Yes, acquire resources is about obtaining the team members, facilities, equipment, materials, supplies, and other resources necessary to complete project work. This might involve negotiation with functional managers or vendors. Then, develop team is focused on improving the competencies, team member interaction, and overall team environment to enhance project performance.
How do you do that?
Through activities like team building exercises, training, recognition and rewards, maybe co-location if possible, and using interpersonal skills like conflict management, motivation, influence, and leadership. A managed team involves tracking individual and team performance, providing feedback, resolving issues, and managing changes to the project team. It's about optimizing team performance.
Manage quality is also in executing. I thought we planned for quality earlier.
You plan quality, but you manage it during execution. Managed quality is about translating the quality management plan into executable quality activities. It's focused on the processes being used to produce the deliverables. Are we following the defined processes? Are they effective? It involves things like quality audits, process analysis to identify improvements, and using quality tools. It's about building confidence that the project will meet the quality standards. Control quality, which we'll get to in monitoring and controlling, is more focused on inspecting the outputs.
Okay, process focus here. Implement risk responses is also in executing.
Makes sense, right? The risk owners who are assigned responsibility for specific responses back in planning now need to actually carry out those agreed upon actions. Maybe implementing a mitigation plan, taking steps to exploit an opportunity, etc.
And conduct procurements. This is where the deals get done.
Yes, this is the process of obtaining seller responses, bids or proposals, selecting a seller based on evaluation criteria, and awarding a contract or purchase order. It involves things like bidder conferences, proposal evaluations, and negotiations. The output is a formal agreement or contract.
So executing is definitely the busy phase, doing the work, managing the people and resources, ensuring quality processes are followed, implementing risk plans, and handling procurements. Which leads us logically to monitoring and controlling, keeping a close eye on all of this activity.
This group is all about tracking progress, reviewing performance, and regulating the project. Essentially, comparing where you are, actual performance, to where you plan to be, the baselines in the project management plan. Identifying any variances, assessing their impact, and recommending corrective or preventive actions if needed. And critically, managing changes formally.
The core process here seems to be monitor and control project work, kind of the central hub.
It is. This process tracks, reviews, and reports the overall progress to meet the performance objectives defined in the plan. It collects that work performance information, the analyzed data, the variances, from all the other controlling processes to get a consolidated picture of the project's health. It then generates work performance reports to communicate status, progress, and forecasts to stakeholders. It also generates change requests if issues or variances require formal action or adjustments to the plan.
And perform integrated change control, ICC, sounds absolutely crucial here.
It's vital for maintaining the integrity of the baselines. This is the formal, documented process for reviewing all change requests, approving, rejecting, or deferring them, managing the approved changes, and communicating the decisions. There's often a change control board, CCB, involved, especially for significant changes impacting baselines. But the source makes it clear the PM usually has ultimate responsibility for managing this process. It happens throughout the project lifecycle, from start to finish.
It keeps the project from just drifting away from the original plan due to uncontrolled changes.
Oh, what?
Okay, you also validate scope here. That sounds like getting acceptance.
Yes, but it's very specific. Validate scope is the process of formalizing acceptance of the completed project deliverables. This typically happens by the customer or sponsor. It's done periodically throughout the project as deliverables are finished, not just at the very end. And importantly, it usually occurs after the control quality process has verified internally that the deliverable meets the specified quality requirements.
So control quality checks it's correct. Validate scope gets the customer to sign off on it.
Exactly. Validate scope uses techniques like inspection, reviews, audits, walkthroughs to gain that formal acceptance. The output is accepted deliverables.
Okay, so then control scope is different. That's about preventing scope creep during the project.
Precisely. Control scope is the process of monitoring the status of the project and product scope and managing changes to the scope baseline. It uses techniques like variance analysis to compare the work being done against the baseline WBS and scope statement to make sure only approved scope is being worked on and to detect any unapproved changes.
Control schedule then tracks progress against the schedule baseline using that work performance information.
Key here is comparing planned progress to actual progress. Earned Value Management, EVM, provides powerful metrics like schedule variance, SV, which tells you if you are ahead or behind schedule in dollar terms, earned value minus plan value, and the Schedule Performance Index, SPI, which measures schedule efficiency, earned value divided by plan value. An SPI less than 1 means you're behind schedule. You use variance analysis, trend analysis, and maybe rerun critical path analysis or use compression techniques if needed.
And control costs work similarly, but for the budget, using EVM metrics like cost variance, CV, and cost performance index, CPI.
Correct. CV, earned value minus actual cost, tells you if you are over or under budget for the work performed. CPI, earned value divided by actual cost, measures cost efficiency. A CPI less than 1 means you're over budget for the work done. This is also where you do forecasting, calculating the estimate at completion, ETC, which is your best guess of the total project cost based on current performance. There are various formulas for EAC. You also calculate the estimate to complete, ETC, the expected cost to finish the remaining work.
And that TCPI metric, to complete performance index.
Yeah, TCPI is interesting. It tells you the cost performance that must be achieved on the remaining work to meet a specific financial goal, like the original budget at completion, BAC, or the current EAC. It's basically work remaining divided by funds remaining. If TCPI is greater than 1, it's harder to achieve than your past performance. You also monitor the status of your contingency and management reserves here, reserve analysis.
Okay, EVM gives you a real integrated view of schedule and cost performance. Control quality, we touched on this. This is where you check if the actual outputs, the deliverables, meet the quality standards.
Yes. Control quality monitors and records the results of executing the quality management activities to assess performance and ensure the project outputs are complete, correct, and meet customer expectations. This is where you use tools like inspection, testing, peer reviews. Statistical tools like control charts are key. Here they show if a process is stable or has predictable performance. They have upper and lower control limits, UCL, OCL, and a mean. The source mentions the rule of 7. If 7 consecutive data points fall on one side of the mean, even if within limits, it might indicate a non-random issue that needs investigation. Other tools include histograms, Pareto diagrams, scatter diagrams.
So control quality finds defects, validates scope, gets acceptance.
Right. The output of control quality include quality control measurements and verified deliverables, which then become input to validate scope.
Got it. You're also controlling resources, communications, and risks in this monitoring and controlling group. It seems like you're controlling everything that was planned.
Pretty much, yes. It's about ensuring things stay on track or taking action if they deviate. Control resources ensures that the physical resources assigned are available as planned and monitors planned versus actual utilization. Control communications monitors and controls communications throughout the project lifecycle to ensure the information needs of the project stakeholders are met. Are the right people getting the right info effectively? And monitor risks is crucial. It's about tracking identified risks, monitoring residual risks, identifying and analyzing due risk, and evaluating the effectiveness of your risk response processes throughout the project. Are the responses working? Do we need new ones? How are our reserves holding up? This is continuously happening.
And finally, control procurements managing the relationship with the sellers.
Yes, monitoring contract performance, managing procurement relationships, making changes and corrections to contracts as needed, ensuring compliance with terms, managing payments, and closing out contracts once the work is complete and satisfactory. It involves performance reviews, inspections and audits of the seller's work, claims administration if disputes arise.
Okay, so monitoring and controlling is really the heartbeat of the project during execution, constantly checking, analyzing performance, reporting, and managing changes to keep things aligned with the plan or adjusting the plan formally. That brings us to the final group, the closing process group, wrapping it all up.
This is where you formally complete and finalize all activities for the project, a phase, or a contract. It involves getting final acceptance, performing administrative closure activities like finalizing records, archiving information, and releasing the project team and other resources.
The source notes that in adaptive or agile projects, even if a project closes prematurely, value might have already been delivered through the earlier completed increments because work is often prioritized by value.
That's a good point about Agile, yes. The main process here is simply called close project or phase. You review the project management plan to ensure all project work is completed and that the project has met its objectives. Key activities include obtaining final formal acceptance of the deliverables, confirming validate scope is complete, transferring the final product, service, or result to the ongoing operations group or the next phase, completing financial closure, collecting and archiving all project records, updating those organizational process assets, especially with final lessons learned, conducting a final project performance review or audit, and celebrating the team's accomplishments.
And the key outputs reflect this closure. The final product handover, a final report summarizing performance, and those crucial updates to the OPAs, especially the lessons learned knowledge base.
Exactly. Leaving a documented trail of knowledge and experience for future projects to benefit from.
Okay, wow. We have genuinely taken a real deep dive here, following the structure laid out in these sources, based on that PMBOK framework. From understanding the very definition of a project and its strategic importance, all the way through initiating it, planning it meticulously, executing the work, constantly monitoring and controlling everything, and finally, closing it out properly.
Hopefully this gives you, our listeners, a much clearer, more insightful picture of the deliberate structure and the discipline behind successful projects. It's really less about just getting stuff done randomly and much more about how you navigate the inherent complexity, how you manage uncertainty, lead people effectively, and ensure you're actually delivering the intended value within that broader organizational context.
Yeah, whether you're maybe studying for a certification or about to lead your first major initiative, or maybe you're just curious how large, complex undertakings manage to stay on track, grasping these fundamentals, the why and the how, seems absolutely key. We saw how project success is fundamentally tied back to achieving the strategic why, the business case, the benefits, not just hitting the original time and budget numbers, though those are important too.
And we touched on the real value of learning from the past, those OPAs and lessons learned using specific tools and techniques to manage risks and changes proactively, and the constant need to keep stakeholders appropriately engaged throughout the entire journey.
So here's something to maybe mull over. Given that true project success, as we've discussed, is really measured by achieving that core why, delivering the strategic value and the intended benefits, how does understanding the how, all these structured processes, tools, and techniques we've explored, how does that fundamentally change how you might approach your next project or major endeavor?
Yeah. What's maybe one specific idea or technique from this deep dive that you can consciously apply to ensure your focus stays squarely on delivering that intended value, especially when you inevitably face those challenges, uncertainties, and changes that pop up on almost every project? How do you keep the why front and center while navigating the how?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you on the next one.